Again, it's a big privilege and a big honor to welcome you to this gathering. It's an open lecture organized by Lutz, and the invited guest is David Rubin, and I will just briefly introduce him. David Rubin is an American Jew who made Aliyah, immigrated to Israel. He became a mayor in the biblical city of Shiloh. And for those of you who know your Bible, you know that that's where the tabernacle was standing for the first years. He was a mayor there. He's also an author, and he will talk a little bit about his books as well. And he's also a well-known political analyst in Israel, an expert on the Middle East. And when I say an expert on the Middle East, I always think about when I went to the Hebrew University, because I had a lecturer who said, it's impossible to become an expert on the Middle East, because it keeps changing all the time. So anyway, we do have an expert among us, and let's give David Rubin a big hand.
Thank you. When we talk about being an expert about the Middle East, I'll explain it very simply like this. I've heard many Israeli politicians traveling outside of Israel, and they speak about Israel for an entire hour. They always mention peace, maybe about 15 or 20 times. They usually do not say the word God. Anyone who can talk about the Middle East and Israel for an entire hour without saying the word God doesn't understand anything about Israel or the Middle East. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people who don't understand anything about Israel or the Middle East. But since I'm speaking to you, I feel like as we say, full disclosure, cards on the table. With me, I'm very much an open book, and I tell people who I am. So, I originally come from the United States. I believe you announced that. I've been living in Israel for 22 years. This is my third visit to Sweden. My first visit to Sweden was about 35 years ago, when I was still living in New York, and I considered myself to be an atheist. And I came to Sweden to visit my girlfriend, who was living in, who was Swedish. And I came here, and I spent some time here, and I traveled around Europe. It was quite an interesting trip for me. About 6 months later, when I was back in New York, I had a conversation with her. And this was during the time of the Lebanon War in 1982. And I'll talk more about Israel's history in a moment. But she said, "What do you think about the Lebanon War? About what Israel is doing in Lebanon?" And I said, "Well, I think what they're doing is what needs to be done. Israel has been suffering from a lot of terrorism coming from Lebanon, and I only regret that Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister of Israel at that time, I regret that Menachem Begin didn't drive Yasser Arafat the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization at that time, didn't drive him out of Lebanon. So she said to me, well, you know, Menachem Begin is also a terrorist. Now a chill went down my back when she said that. Because we had a big argument after that. And I think that was the beginning of the end of that relationship. I'm sorry to say. Because she couldn't understand, or didn't understand, the true story of Israel and the true story of the Middle East. And I didn't know how to explain it. For me, it was just very emotional, being Jewish. So, that's one story about my experience with Sweden. My second story about Sweden is that on that first visit to Sweden, when I arrived in Sweden, I went to Malmö. And I was, being a New Yorker, I was amazed that people were actually standing, waiting for the traffic light to change before crossing the street. And there were no cars coming. What struck me about Malmö was that it was so carefree. People were just very, very mellow and relaxed and friendly and nice. And I know that Malmö is not like that anymore. I'm sure there are nice people still in Malmö, but I know that things have changed in Sweden tremendously. And I know this from talking to my friends who are from Malmö and now live in the United States. And they told me about it, and I was very, very troubled to hear what they told me and about how dangerous it is now. And then they started to tell me about how it's because of the growing Muslim population in Malmö. And when I told them that I was going to use that information in my book, The Islamic Tsunami, they quickly said, no, please, don't use our names, I don't want to be a part of anything so hateful. I said, there's nothing hateful about this. I'm trying to bring some truth about what is happening in the world today. But I thought it was very Swedish, the reaction. That she said, no, we can't speak against any group of people. I think we need to be honest about what is happening in the world today, what is happening in Western civilization. Okay, but first I'm going to speak about Israel. There are a lot of misconceptions about Israel. One of those misconceptions, misunderstandings about Israel is this whole Palestinian issue. Now, if you read the news in Sweden, or any Western country for that matter, you would think that Israel has taken control of the ancient country of Palestine. The problem is that there is no ancient country of Palestine. There is only Israel. Well, let me explain it more clearly, okay? I'm going to give you a 5-minute history of Israel. So you have to listen very carefully because the 5 minutes will be up and you will have missed it if you start daydreaming. So please listen very carefully. after slavery in Egypt. Okay, we just had the Jewish holiday of Passover, where we remember how we were brought out of slavery in Egypt. Okay, we spent 40 years wandering in the desert. We came into, we received, let us not forget, we received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Moses received the Ten Commandments. We looked and we saw this fire on the mountain. Everyone in Israel was a witness to this event. We come into the land of Israel. 14 years later, Joshua brings the children of Israel, the Israelites, to Shiloh. Shiloh is in Samaria. That is the northern part of what the world calls the West Bank. How many of you have heard of the West Bank? And how many of you have read about it in your Bibles? No, you haven't. The West Bank is not mentioned once in the Bible. How many of you have heard about Palestine? And how many of you have read about it in your Bibles? Okay, you're not going to be fooled this time, I see. Of course not. It is not mentioned in the Bible, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So, Joshua sets up the tabernacle, which was the precursor of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. He sets it up in Shiloh, with stone walls on the side, indicating permanence in the land. That we were going to have to not just rely on the Almighty God to give us our food from the heavens, from the manna. No longer were we going to rely on Moses raising his hands in the air and then the battle would be won. No, we need to set up an army. We need to go out in the fields and to grow food. We need to build homes, and we need to plant trees, and we need to have a permanent place of worship. This was the beginning of Zionism. You all know the term Zionism, which means the Israelis building up the land of Israel once again, the people of Israel building up the land of Israel once again and returning to the land of Israel. Well, I call that period 3,300 years ago the beginning of Zionism, the first period of Zionism, because we were going to build up the land. So the tabernacle and the capital of Israel stood in Shiloh for 369 years. Joshua said to the children of Israel, and this is from the book of Joshua, chapter 18, verse 3, "How long will you wait before coming to take possession of the land that the Lord God of your fathers has given you?" Those words that were spoken in that day were not just spoken to the Israelites of that day, and were not just spoken for the Israelis of today, and were not just spoken for the Jews around the world, but were spoken for everybody who understands that God's sovereignty is on that land. And those words that Joshua said, everyone who had the 7 tribes that had not yet received their inheritance in the land, they went out and they conquered the land of Israel. Eventually, a woman named Hannah comes to Shiloh to pray for a son. The son who was born from her prayers was Samuel, who grew up into prophecy in Shiloh, Samuel the prophet. And he was the one who would eventually appoint the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David. David sets up the unified capital. Yes, I know I went over my 5 minutes. I'm sorry. David was the one who sets up the capital, the unified capital in Jerusalem, and the capital remains there. Israel's sovereignty over the land of Israel was well over 1,000 years. Eventually, the Romans conquer Israel, and after the first temple had been destroyed, we built a second temple in Jerusalem. The Romans conquer the land. The Romans scatter Israel around the world to the four corners of the earth. We are exiled from the land. The Romans changed the name of the land of Israel to Palestina, naming it after the Philistines, who were the enemy of Israel. Okay, I often say it's like renaming. It's like a conqueror taking over the United States of America and renaming it Al-Qaeda. Okay, it's the same idea. That's what they did. So they changed the names of the land from Israel to Palestina. There never was an ancient country called Palestine. And I challenge anybody, if there's anyone who's sitting here this evening, who's thinking, but everyone always talks about the Palestinians. Well, I challenge you to tell me, what was the monetary currency of that Palestinian nation? No one can answer that question. Or if I ask, who was the leader of that Palestinian nation? No one can answer that question, because there never was a nation called Palestine. Yes, I know there were invaders in the land of Israel. There were the Christian Crusaders and the Ottoman Turks and the British. All of these were colonial powers in the land of Israel. But there was never an indigenous nation that lived in the land of Israel. In fact, the author, Mark Twain, visited the land of Israel in the late 19th century. And he wrote about this in one of his books. And he talks about how the land is barren, how he could walk for miles and there is hardly a tree, hardly a plant, hardly a flower, hardly a person. So where did all the people come from? Well, near the end of the 19th century, the Jewish people started returning to the land of Israel, started building it up again, creating an economy, and draining the swamps, building up the land. And when that happened, what do you think happened as well? Arabs started moving in from the Arabian Peninsula, from the eastern side of the Jordan River, the so-called, they don't call that the East Bank, you notice, from the eastern side of the Jordan River, and they were looking for jobs. Okay, I know the stereotype that Jews are good in business, right? We knew how to build up an economy. It's not a bad thing. I'm not ashamed of Jews being good in business. So they built up an economy, and in 1948, the State of Israel is reestablished. But what happened in 1948? All of the Arab armies invaded. They took control of eastern Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem where the two temples had stood. King David's capital. They took control of King David and King Solomon's capital. They took control of Judea, which is south of Jerusalem, the so-called southern part of the so-called West Bank. They took control of all of Samaria, the northern part of the so-called West Bank. They took control of the Golan Heights and the Gaza district and the Sinai desert. but the state of Israel survived. Then in 1964, the Arabs, seeing that they're not succeeding at destroying Israel, they create the Palestine Liberation Organization. They say, we're going to create a new people, a Palestinian people. We'll say that they are the indigenous people in the land, and we will drive the Jews into the sea. To this day, they are still saying that, and people are believing it. Then in 1967, they attacked from all sides. They attack Israel from all sides. And remember, Israel is a tiny country, okay, much smaller than Sweden. They attacked from all sides. And guess what happened in that war in 1967? Israel recaptures the old city of Jerusalem, recaptures all of Judea, recaptures all of Samaria, recaptures the Golan Heights, the Sinai Desert, the Gaza district. All of this happens in 6 days, and on the 7th day we rested, because the 7th day was a Jewish Sabbath. This is not a normal thing, but this is how it happened. Jumping ahead, 1993, the Oslo Peace Accords are signed on the White House lawn in Washington, D.C. Yasser Arafat is present. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin of Israel is present. And President Bill Clinton, looking like a proud grandfather, hovering over the event. The day after Yasser Arafat, the day after they signed these Oslo Peace Accords, saying that from here on in all differences will be settled peacefully, Yasser Arafat flies to South Africa to speak in a mosque. Before I tell you about his appearance at that mosque, I need to explain something to you, if you don't know already. Very often they describe Jerusalem as the home of the 3 great monotheistic religions. I even heard the tourism minister of Israel once say that. However, Judaism, yes, Judaism was born in the land of Israel. We could say that Judaism comes from the land of Israel, right? Obviously, Jerusalem was the capital of Israel for all of those years. And we also know that there was a man named Jesus who also taught in Jerusalem. So we can also say that, oh, by the way, he was a Jew. He did live in the land of Israel. He was actually born in Bethlehem, which is part of the so-called West Bank. So he was a settler. Anyhow, so we could certainly say that Christianity was born in the land of Israel. But Islam wasn't. Islam was started by a man named Muhammad 1,400 years ago. He said that he was a prophet, and none of the Jews or the Christians on the Arabian Peninsula where he lived believed that he was a prophet. So he became angry, and he created his own religion. He called it Islam. His own holy book called the Quran. And by the way, he was illiterate. He had to have somebody write it for him from his teachings. But what were his teachings? Well, there are 3 basic principles in Islam that I have learned, and this doesn't come from David Rubin, who wrote the Islamic Tsunami. This comes from the Quran itself and from the Hadith, which is the oral tradition of Islam. There is the concept of Jihad, which means holy war against non-Muslims. Then there is the concept of Taqiyya. Okay, many people don't know about Taqiyya. Taqiyya means deception or lying to further the cause of Islam. Now, Judaism, the highest concept is love your neighbor as yourself. Christianity, I think we could say that the highest concept is love your neighbor as yourself. Jihad seems to be the opposite of love your neighbor as yourself. And Taqiyya, lying, certainly I know it's not acceptable in Judaism. We're supposed to be honest. So, okay, that brings us back to Yasser Arafat. He flies to South Africa to speak in this mosque. And he gives his fiery Yasser Arafat speech. He says, "With blood and fire we will liberate you, O Jerusalem. And I call on all of my Muslim brothers and sisters to stand with me in the struggle for Jerusalem. Jihad, jihad, jihad." Then he leaves the mosque. He flies back to New York. He was supposed to speak at the UN, I believe. He comes out of the terminal at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York, and he's greeted by a group of reporters who had heard about the speech in South Africa. One of them shouts out to him, "Mr. Arafat, you just signed the Oslo peace accords, saying that you're going to work out everything peacefully between you and Israel. How can you be calling for jihad?" And he looked at them with that sly Yasser Arafat smile that I will never forget. And he said the following words: "I will continue my jihad for peace." Now, I don't normally do impersonations, but I remember that exactly how he said it. You cannot have a jihad for peace. It's not possible. It is the opposite. But we in Israel know about that, the concept of jihad, unfortunately. We know about it too well. If you take a walk in my neighborhood, you come to house after house after house that has lost children in terrorist attacks. And I'm not exaggerating. There is one street that is called, this is in my home, in my neighborhood in Shiloh. There is one street that is called the Street of Hannah's Prayer. But it could be called Terror Victims Street. One house, the first house on the street, lost their 16-year-old son when he was in his high school library, and a terrorist came in with a machine gun and started shooting, killing him, killing many others. The very next house, their 17-year-old son was standing at a bus stop when a terrorist came with a bomb, blowing himself up, blowing up this 17-year-old boy and several others who were at the bus stop. The very next house on that street, their 19-year-old daughter was at a bus stop also. Two terrorists with guns came and started shooting, shouting, "Itbach al Yehud," kill the Jews. And she was killed, and everyone else at the bus stop was killed. 3 houses further on that street, there was a 17-year-old boy who was playing basketball at his high school with some friends. Terrorists infiltrated the community, started shooting everywhere, killing scores of children. Then you go around the corner from that house, and you come to a family that lost their 5-month-old baby when terrorists on the side of the road, right, they call it freedom fighters, they were throwing rocks at Jewish cars that were passing by. A rock this big hit the baby in the head. He was 5 months old, and he died several days later. There are many other terrorist attacks just in Shiloh and certainly in the biblical heartland. I'm not going to tell you about all of them, but I want you to understand the intensity of what I'm talking about. Well, 12 years ago, I was coming back from Jerusalem in my car, driving home on the dark country road called the Road of the Patriarchs. I was halfway home. I had my 3-year-old son with me in the back seat. He was buckled into the baby seat. And suddenly there is a massive hail of bullets on the car. The car went completely dead when the bullets hit. I saw 3 orange sparks whizzing past my eyes. Obviously the bullets had tracers on them. And the car went completely dead. It wasn't starting. I felt a bullet smash into my left leg. Blood started coming out all over the place from my leg. Then I remembered I have my 3-year-old sitting behind me. I turned around to him. My son's name is Rubin, or Ruby, we call him. I said, "Ruby, are you okay?" His eyes were wide open. His mouth was wide open. He looked like he was trying to scream or to cry, but no sounds were coming out. I didn't see any blood on him, and I could see that he was bleeding, so I assumed that he was okay. Well, I quickly tried to start the car to get away from the terrorists. They were still shooting. I shifted the gears. It was an automatic car. Trying to get it to start, it was dead. It wasn't starting. It was like a dead car on a cold winter day. And the terrorists are still shooting. Finally, I tried on what must have been the 5th or the 6th try. The car suddenly started. It started as if it had never had a problem starting before. I hit the gas. I drove as hard as I could, driving 170 kilometers an hour to get up to the next community up the road where I hoped I could find an ambulance. I get up there and I pull up to the front gate of the community. Now you have to understand that every community in Samaria has a metal gate in the front of the community to keep out car bombers. This is the way we live. So I start shouting to the guard at the gate, "Ambulance, please, get an ambulance." He didn't seem to hear me. But there was a young woman on the side of the road. She started jumping up and down, screaming, "Ambulance, ambulance, don't you hear?" At that point, everyone who was within sound reach came running up to the car. The gas station attendant from the gas station, from the petrol station across the street, ran up to the car. He pulled open the door. He ripped off my shirt, wrapped up my leg to stop the blood flow. He said, "I'm also a paramedic. I know what I'm doing." And he handed me his cell phone. He said, "Call your wife." So I tried to dial. My hand was shaking too much. I couldn't dial. He said, "I'll dial it for you." And I spoke to my wife. I told her I've been shot in the leg. Hopefully an ambulance will soon be coming to take me to the hospital, and Ruby is okay. Well, a minute later, an ambulance pulls up. 2 paramedics leap out of the ambulance. They run up to the car. One of them pulls open the back car door, and he starts unbuckling my son from the baby seat. I said, no, please, leave him alone. He's just in shock. He needs to be with his Abba. He needs to be with his dad." He said, "No, sir. I have to take him out. He pulls him out of the car. He cradles him in his arms and starts running to the ambulance at break speed, at a fast speed, saying he's also been shot. He's been shot in the head. A bullet had gone into his head, we later found out, where the skull meets with the neck, causing a skull fracture and internal bleeding in the cerebellum. Well, they quickly wrapped bandages around his head, put an oxygen mask on his face, whisked both of us into the ambulance, and connected him to the oxygen tank. They took us to the hospital in Jerusalem, on the other side of Jerusalem, and they get to work on us. 20 minutes later, the head surgeon comes up to me and he says, David, we're going to have to operate on both of you within the half an hour. It'll be the first of probably several operations. And there's someone here who wants to talk to you. So a man came up to me who I had never seen before. He says, I'm the public relations director for this hospital. I want you to know that you are the 1,000th victim of terrorism to be hospitalized in this hospital in the past year and a half. I wasn't quite sure what to do with that bit of information. I thought maybe I was supposed to get a prize. But I can laugh now. I wasn't laughing then. He said, the media is massed outside this emergency room. They want to interview the 1,000th victim of terrorism and photograph you and your son, but I will keep them away. I'll protect your privacy. And I thought for a moment, and I thought of all of the terror victims who we already knew, and I thought of how everyone was going to work every day wearing bulletproof vests and helmets. And I said, you bring them in, I have what to say to them. And I've been telling this story ever since. Now, I tell this story not just because of our trauma and that I think it's important to talk about your experiences. And I tell this story not just because I have a political opinions or opinions about what is happening in the world today, even though I'm not shy about my opinions. I tell this story because it's a story of miracles. I was shot in my left leg, even though the terrorists were shooting from the right side, which enabled me to drive my automatic car to get to that ambulance, because we use our right leg when we drive automatic cars. The bullet that went into my son's head and through his neck missed his brainstem by 1 millimeter. Last but not least, there were some miracles that had just revealed miracles, like that fire on the mountain on Mount Sinai, like the splitting of the Red Sea. On my 5th day in the hospital, I get a call from the car mechanic, a nice fellow from Jerusalem named Erez. He says, David, this is Erez. I just want you to know that we have the car. We've started ordering parts. There are 49 bullet holes in the car. It's going to be very difficult to fix, but I just want you to feel relaxed. We have the car. I said, the car? I said, I haven't thought about the car since the attack. I don't care about the car. My son was in the intensive care unit. He was sleeping 22 out of 24 hours of the day because of internal bleeding in his cerebellum. He had total memory loss. He didn't remember his sisters. He didn't remember his little friends from the nursery school who were 3 years old, who sent pictures with their names on it. I said, I don't care about the car. He says, David, I'm just calling because I have to ask you a question. Why can't we start that car? A chill went down my back that I feel to this day, because I know that I tried to get the car to start. I know it wouldn't start. I know I was bleeding like crazy. Finally, the car started as if it had never had a problem starting before. And all I have to tell you is, yes, I may have been an atheist in New York, but we were just lifted up on God's wings to get us to that ambulance. And I knew at that point that God had planted a mission in me. And it took a while till I figured out what it was. When my son came back from the hospital 3 weeks later, he was walking screaming in the middle of the night. Like that scream that he was trying to make that night, apparently. And I hobbled over to him and he screamed even louder. And my wife and I understood that there was deep trauma in this child that needed to be healed. And the more I explored it, the more I realized that there is deep psychological trauma from the terrorism in Israel, and particularly in the biblical heartland of Israel that I'm talking about here. And that is something that needs to be dealt with. Yes, we believe that we came back to the biblical heartland of Israel because that's what we're supposed to do. And we're rebuilding it in our times. But the children need to have that trauma healed, confronted, and cured. And that's why I started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, for the purpose of healing that trauma in the children and rebuilding the biblical heartland of Israel through those children. And that's what's happening. We set up therapy programs using art and music and animals. We have educational programs. We're building playgrounds. And we are truly rebuilding the biblical heartland of Israel and healing the children at the same time. And this is something that I never would have dreamed about 15 years ago. So obviously, things happen. God works in people. And it's just a big blessing. So when I come to speak in places, I talk about this, and I talk about this Islamic tsunami of terrorism that is afflicting the biblical heartland of Israel more than any place else, but also is afflicting Israel as a whole and is afflicting the entire world and Western civilization. Maybe not to the extent that it's affecting Israel. But I speak about two Islamic tsunamis. The first is the Islamic tsunami of terrorism that seeks to intimidate us and frighten us, so we'll be afraid to speak out once that second Islamic tsunami becomes clear. And that is the attempt to change Judeo-Christian civilization to change Western civilization from a Judeo-Christian civilization into an Islamic civilization. This is happening before your eyes. I don't know if you realize it, but it is happening. It's happening in three ways. One, demography, which means population. Your average family in Europe has less than 2 children per family. Your average Islamic family in Europe has 6 or 7 or 8 children per family. Do your basic arithmetic, and you will see where the future is going. Secondly, there are educational attempts. There are attempts to change the educational system and to bring Islam into the educational system, to make Swedes feel guilty if they speak out against Islam. And of course the attempts to bring Sharia law, that oppressive Islamic law, into Western civilization. Now Sharia law says that you cannot build a church, that you cannot build any place of worship other than a Muslim place of worship. Sharia law says that a husband can beat his wife, that a man can have 4 wives, plus any woman that his right hand possesses. Okay, that's a quote from the Quran. Muhammad had 31 wives, so why shouldn't they have as many as they want? And Muhammad had a wife that was 9 years old and not even physically mature. So why shouldn't they be allowed to do that as well? This is the reality in Islamic-dominated societies. And I think that we need to understand that you are not going to be able to combat that unless you take certain steps. One step is to do what we are doing in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. Start getting married again and have children. Okay, in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem, we have anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 children per family. And the fathers are very involved in raising those children. Mothers and fathers together, raising children. Okay, and I got news for you. It's a beautiful thing. It's a great thing to raise children. It's hard, yes. Okay, and I know it's hard to give birth. Yes, my wife told me all about it. But as she also says, she also told me, it gets a lot harder after they're born and you have to raise them. And then they become teenagers and it becomes even harder. But if you raise them well and you teach them well, then eventually you'll become grandparents. Because they'll get married, they'll have their own children, and then they'll come visit you, and then they leave. So you see, you get the rewards eventually. Okay? I'm only joking, partially. But anyhow, children are a blessing. In Israel, we don't talk about large families. We talk about mishpachot bruchot yeledim, which means families that are blessed with children. Children are a blessing. So that's one way of countering that Islamic tsunami. It's a positive way. Another way is to halt immigration from Islamic countries. I don't understand in Western civilization that people have this desire to self-destruct. If you don't control your borders, the country is going to cease to exist as a Judeo-Christian civilization. That's the reality. It's an unpleasant reality. People don't want to hear it. They say, oh, no, don't want to hear it, don't want to talk about it. It's real. A third way of countering that Islamic tsunami is to connect with Israel. It's not an accident that it says in the book of Genesis, those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed, and all of the nations shall be blessed through you, through Israel. The blessings come to those nations that stand with Israel. And I am absolutely convinced that the blessings will come back to the Western countries once they start partnering with Israel and standing with Israel. So how does one partner with Israel practically? Okay, first of all, pray for Israel. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, as the expression goes. But praying for the peace of Jerusalem doesn't just mean praying in some general way. And it doesn't mean praying that the Jews will find Jesus and will come to be Christians. It means praying that Israel will act in biblically consistent ways, and that the leaders of the free world will act in biblically consistent ways in supporting Israel. And I know that doesn't really include Obama, and Obama's a bit of a problem. That's why the subtitle of the Islamic tsunami is Israel and America in the Age of Obama. Okay, but Obama is a particular problem, but we don't have time to get into the problems with Obama. But we need to pray that leaders will act biblically. And we need to tell the politicians that there can be no peace agreement in which any kind of Islamic terrorist state is established in the biblical heartland of Israel. It is anti-biblical because the biblical borders say that Israel needs to extend all the way to the Euphrates River and to the Mediterranean Sea, to the great river of Egypt and up to the Lebanon. So we can't act in anti-biblical ways because peace will not be had that way. Thirdly, we have to understand that the Islamic politicians who we're dealing with today cannot be trusted because of Taqiyya, because of Islamic deception. In my latest book, Peace for Peace, Israel and the New Middle East, I explain that there will be no peace agreement that can be signed that includes Israel giving away its sovereignty over the land of Israel. Thirdly, partner with Israel in practical ways as well. And when I come here, I'm always speaking, when I come and travel outside of Israel, I'm always speaking about the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund and trying to get people to stand with us and support what we're doing. Now, occasionally there is someone who says to me, well, usually they don't say it, but occasionally there is a person who's thinking, why should I support children's projects in Israel? I'm a Christian. Why should I support children's projects in Israel? Well, to understand that, we need to read from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31. Okay, so if you have a Bible, you can read along with me. I love how I say, if you have a Bible, you can read along with me, and everyone pulls out their iPhones. Anyway, I'm still in the old ages, but it's okay. Okay, Jeremiah chapter 31. Okay, God is speaking through Jeremiah, and he says the following words to Israel. For I have loved you with an eternal love. Therefore I have extended kindness to you. I shall yet rebuild you, and you shall be rebuilt, O Israel. You will yet adorn yourself with drums, and go forth in the dance of merrymakers. You shall yet plant vineyards in the mountains of Samaria. The planter shall plant and redeem. For there will come a day when watchmen will call out on Mount Ephraim, arise, let us go up to Zion, to the Lord our God. Now we know about rebuilding Samaria. I've been speaking about that. So we know it's happening. We see the prophecy coming to life. We see vineyards all over the region of Shiloh and in Samaria. We know that it's happening. It's the fulfillment of prophecy in our times. And we know about Mount Ephraim because Joshua was from the biblical tribe of Ephraim, and he set up the tabernacle in Shiloh because he was from the tribe of Ephraim. But who are those watchmen that it's mysteriously talking about here? Well, what I do when I want to understand the Bible is that I look in the Torah, okay, in the Hebrew Bible. And in the original Hebrew, the word for watchman is Notzrim. In modern Hebrew, Notzrim means Christians. So what do you think it's talking about here? Christians need to be involved in the rebuilding of Israel in these times. And that is how you bring the blessings. That is the best way to bring blessings back to Sweden. And together to rebuild the biblical heartland of Israel.
Tonight, and I believe really this is something that it's a worthy case for us to identify ourselves with. One of the ladies that were interviewed there, she said, "Anachnu kulanu chaim et ze." We are all living this. This is a part of our reality. This is part of our daily lives. And this is what it is. I have had the privilege of being in Shiloh 3 times during the last year with groups. And when you drive on those roads to get there, you never know what can happen around the next curve. So I really believe that this is something we should support. And I just want to mention a little story in the New Testament. It's written about the centurion that had a servant that was sick. The leaders of Capernaum, the Jewish leaders of Capernaum, come to Jesus and they ask, "Can you come and heal his servant?" And then they say, "He is well worth that you do this because he loves our people." But how did they know that he loved their people? Because they continue the sentence and they say, "And he has built our synagogue." So that's how they will know that we love them when we really participate, when we do something practical. So I would just encourage you to do that. We will take up an offering here right now to this case here. And we have baskets that we will send around. And also, if you don't have money with you, you can fill in one of these and just write down the amount and write clearly that it should go to Shiloh Israel Children Fund. Okay? Shiloh Israel. If you just remember Shiloh Israel, we will figure out the rest. So, yeah, just raise your hand and she's coming around. So I'll give you some time to fill out those forms. And meanwhile, do you want to say something about your books meanwhile while they're filling in the forms? Or?
Okay, I was just telling him he could hand out the brochures.
Okay, this is excellent. So, yeah, so you can get a brochure also about this Shiloh Children Israel Fund. Shiloh Israel Children Fund. It's complicated. So, but if you want to say a few words yourself.
אני תמיד שם את זה בידיים
בדיוק. זה טוב. It's just 4 words, but it's hard to get them right order. So, please. And he has some books here, and you can say a few words about it yourself.
Okay. Okay, so I was asked to possibly answer a few questions while you're doing that. Let me just tell you before I answer questions. I see you. Go first. Unfortunately, there are occasional technical difficulties, so you didn't get to see the rest of the film. But we have over 1,000 children who are benefiting from these programs at any given time, and it's growing all the time. As far as the formal treatments, the formal therapeutic treatments, there are about 400 to 500 children at any given time who are in treatment, and as far as the informal treatments, then we're going, far beyond 1,000, more like 2,000 children who are benefiting from these programs. Okay, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you for this enlightening, really presentation, and for the good presentation of Israel. Was really good. One question: where do you see Israel in 20 years? It's maybe not a shortest kind of question, but I would be really interested how you would analyze it and really predict the situation, where it will go, and what will happen.
Okay, that's an interesting question. It's an interesting question that I don't get asked very often, so it's a good one. Okay, as a believing Jew, and as you heard from what I've said earlier, I think that we are very much in prophetic times. We are seeing the fulfillment of prophecy in our times. And I think that Israel is going to continue to grow. Israel is going to continue to grow both physically, and physically meaning geographically and in terms of population growth. We are the only place in the Western world, the only place in Western civilization that is growing in terms of its population. Okay, putting the Muslims to the side for a minute. The only place, because people are getting married younger and having more children, and I see that growth as continuing. That is the trend. People are becoming more traditional. They're modern, yes. The women work. It's not like the women have to sacrifice their careers. Everyone is. People live in the modern world and they work together on behalf of the children. So that's part of it. Politically, I don't know if you realize, but Israel has recently discovered natural gas. We have some of the largest natural gas reserves in the world. And it's only now beginning to be developed. I think the ramifications for international politics can be very great in that respect. If we're a major energy exporter, which we will be within 10 years, then I think that will change things a bit if people aren't so dependent on Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and countries like that for their energy needs. Last but not least, I think we're going to see a continued spiritual revival in Israel, which hopefully we'll see in the Western world as well. But as far as Israel is concerned, I am absolutely sure that we're going to see the second phase of the book of Ezekiel, where God puts His Spirit in us. We already see it in Israel, a return to tradition and return to God. And I think that trend is going to continue. And with God's help and with the help of our actions, I hopefully within 20 years we'll see the coming of Messiah and the rebuilding of His kingdom on earth. But I'm not predicting the exact year like that. I know some Christian commentators say that they have it all figured out. It's going to happen exactly in this year, and right because of the moons and all this stuff. I don't get into that. But we see the trends in prophecy. And so Israel will continue to grow and will continue to thrive. And God willing, some of those lights from Zion will go out to the rest of the world as well. Other questions? Okay, if you want, you could ask your question in Swedish and somebody can translate if you need that.
How was your son today?
Okay, my son had a full recovery, a complete recovery, and he is now 15 years old, and he's busy being a teenager. And we're thankful for that. We've been very blessed. Yes, ma'am. There are about 6,000 or 7,000 people in the entire Shiloh township. But this is big growth. It started out with, in 1978, there were just 8 families that came. And the Prime Minister of Israel was very nervous about what the world was going to say if they start settling Shiloh again. So they announced it as an archaeological expedition. But in truth, everyone knew what was really happening, and the growth has continued.
Is that all Samaria?
Yes, all of Samaria, the Israeli population is growing. It's growing quite. It's the fastest growing population in all of Israel. Okay, so when they say that we're an obstacle to peace, I say, no, we are not an obstacle to peace, but we are an obstacle to an Islamic terrorist state in the biblical heartland of Israel. Because our population is going to continue to grow. We're growing faster than the Muslim population. And within a certain number of years, there'll be nothing to negotiate about. And they know that, and that's why they're in such a state of panic, and they're running to the United Nations. And as far as I'm concerned, let them go to the United Nations. They can become members of every committee that they want to become members of, as long as we're able to continue growing. Other questions? Okay. If there are no more questions, then I put it back in your hands.
So let's just give him a big hand.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to have you back again another time. And also thank you for coming. It was a short notice, but thank you for coming and showing up. And use the information that you got here to say something good about Israel. Amen.